Welcome, everybody. Wow, this is a nice group. It's so great that you all could join us this evening at the end of a long week. We've got our three speakers here in the room. So Saagar is going to go first, and then Megan and Billy, and of course, a wide variety of topics. I'm Kockelman. I'm a professor of transportation engineering, so that's in the Department of Civil Engineering. And I'm really lucky that Aman had put me in touch with Saagar early on in his thesis. So Saagar's in electrical, and I'm in civil, so our buildings are right next to one another. But we've got Megan in art and art history, and Billy who's in McCombs, and then of course Saagar is also in McCombs, as well as Plan II for all of you. So that's fantastic. Does anybody have any questions before I go ahead and introduce Saagar's presentation? Feel free to add questions throughout the presentation, and then I'll go ahead and help bring those to Saagar's attention. And of course, if there's time, you're welcome to unmute yourself. And I'm actually going to give these students 15 minutes each, because we do have 75 to 90 minutes in the Zoom room, so they have a lot more than the 8 minutes that they were originally told, I think. So we'll try to give them time to tell you a little more in depth about their work. And Saagar is going to be speaking about 1800 to zero, which has to do with power delivery and decarbonizing the grid here in the United States and in Texas in particular. So his work has been on pathways to a zero carbon power grid. And we're excited to hear what you have to say, Saagar.
Cool. Yeah, so let me go ahead and just share my screen real quick. Okay, cool. Everyone can see that, I'm guessing, and everyone can hear me and all the, okay, great. Cool. So, hey everyone, my name is Saagar. I will be talking today about pathways to a zero carbon US power grid. Just to briefly overview and highlight what I'm going to talk about. I'll talk a little bit about why this matters, where we are in terms of transitioning, a few issues that grid operators think about, and then I'll dive into some technological and policy solutions to help drive that transition along. So let's talk about why this matters. The US power grid produced roughly 1,800 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions in 2018. And just to give some context to that, that's about 27% of all US emissions and about 3.5% of all global emissions. And there's a cost to that. It's roughly about $147 billion in 2011, mostly in the form of premature deaths due to air pollution. So in other words, if you have a zero carbon power grid that's just as reliable and does all the same things that our current power grid does today, then you save hundreds of billions of dollars annually in hidden costs. So, kind of zooming out, looking at the bigger picture, getting the US power grid to zero is much more important because it also enables other sectors of the economy like transportation or heavy industry to reduce their emissions as they electrify. So let's kind of take a look at where we are right now. So this chart basically shows where electricity has come from over the past 2 decades. 63% of that comes from coal and natural gas. Coal is in black, natural gas is in gray. And we see this really steady trend for natural gas to replace coal plants. But that leaves 37% of electricity that is decarbonized. So nuclear is that big yellow section here, and that has provided a fairly steady 20% of power for the past few decades. It's been pretty stagnant, as have hydropower and geothermal. And if we look at that top section of that chart in gold and dark blue, so gold is solar and blue is wind, and they don't amount to all that much right now, but it's pretty evident that they're growing quickly, right? So solar wasn't even on the radar a decade ago. Wind wasn't considerable either at the turn of the century. But by and large, these trends are just driven by cost. So these charts show how quickly the cost of wind electricity and solar electricity have dropped in recent years. And so as a result, wind and solar are these highly competitive sources for new electricity generation. And most new additions to the power grid at this point are some mix of solar, wind, and natural gas, whereas most retirements from the grid are coal, nuclear, and older natural gas plants. So, that establishes where our electricity comes from, but then it raises the question, okay, well, if wind and solar are so competitive, then what's the issue, right? Why don't you just build out a ton of that and call it a day? So I need to discuss a few important terms first. Really everything is about keeping the grid stable, right? And reliability for the grid just means that every single second of every single day, you always have enough generation capacity to match the amount of electricity that you use. So these charts basically show how much power we've used in Texas, both over the course of a day and over a year. And if we look on the year side of things, it looks like over around the August, July months, when Texas summers get really, really hot. Everyone wants to turn on their AC. That's when demand peaks. And so as a result, if you want a stable grid, you need to build to that level, right? Even if you're wasting, all this capacity the rest of the year, that's where you need to build to. But it actually gets a little bit more complicated than that, right? You can't just make sure you have enough supply. You need to perfectly match supply with demand every single millisecond of every single day. And this is a basic idea behind this thing called frequency generation, which is super important to making sure that basically the entire system doesn't just break down immediately. The issue with wind and solar, though, is that they output different amounts of power from second to second, right? We all know that the wind doesn't always blow. We all know that the sun doesn't always shine. And we have these regular climate patterns throughout the year that make wind and solar more or less effective depending on which month it is. So looking at that left-hand chart, right, intermittency is basically looking like generators here, solar PV panels, not producing a consistent amount of power throughout the day. And on the right-hand side, we see how seasonality is basically affecting how effective wind turbines are from month to month in different parts of the country. Okay, so now the question becomes, given intermittency and seasonality from wind and solar, how do you ensure that you're always able to match up supply and demand in a zero carbon power grid? And to do that, you need to discuss some technologies. So batteries are the first technology. It's a really, really great solution to daily intermittency, especially when it comes to storing hours of power. So just to give a brief look at what that looks like, I want to take a look at this chart. So this chart basically tracks hypothetical production throughout the day in a 90% decarbonized power grid. And if you look at this lighter green section of the chart, that's solar. So solar produces the bulk of the electricity, during the middle of the day when there's the sun out. And so the idea is when you have all this production, you charge up grid batteries, that's that gray section here, and you discharge it at night when solar drops off, and that's that orange section here. And so that's how we basically solve daily level intermittency. But if you zoom out, So, the economics for batteries have been rapidly improving over the past decade. Between 2010 and 2020, you've seen basically a 90% drop in the cost to make lithium-ion batteries, which is mainly just driven by heavy R&D from both the consumer electronics and the automotive sectors. And these prices are what enable, several large-scale projects. For example, the Hornsdale Power Reserve in South Australia. Here's a photo of that, and basically this one installation is responsible for solving the entire power grid issue in South Australia. It's also been enormously profitable for the developers of the project, and every single consumer there has benefited from a more stable, reliable power grid. Zooming out from a day, though, to a year, looking at seasonality, that's where hydrogen comes into play. It's a much more attractive option than batteries when it comes to storing large amounts of power for months at a time, largely just due to the high capital costs that would be required to solve this problem with batteries. It's a little bit less efficient overall in terms of energy in, energy out, and it's also much more difficult to store and transport. But it's also, at the same time, important to decarbonizing other industries too. So it's going to be something that plays into the power grid also. There's actually one other issue that's associated with solar and wind that I didn't mention before, and it has to do with geography. So basically, wind and solar aren't actually strongest where people live. So take a look at that left map and focus in on the red and purple areas. That's where wind is most effective in the US. And if you look at that right map, that's basically solar. But obviously the problem is that most people don't live on the Great Plains and most people don't live in the Southwest. They all live in the East Coast or the Midwest, right? And so the problem is that, the optimal locations for solar and wind aren't where people actually live. And this wouldn't be an issue if you could transport electricity over long distances in large quantities, but today's infrastructure is a major bottleneck to that. So here's what the US power grid actually looks like. You see these three colors here. You have blue, purple, and cyan. And basically they are functionally independent grids. It's really, really difficult to transport power from one color to another color. These are basically called interconnects. We see these like pink lines here, and those represent high voltage direct current lines. Those are really useful for transmitting a large amount of power efficiently over a really long distance. And you also have these pink triangles here, here, here. Those are called interties, and that's where power can flow between the interconnects. But the problem is that there's a really limited amount of capacity here. And so, expanding transmission infrastructure is really important because that's what enables new investment into generation in the first place, right? Without transmission capacity in an area, investment into new generation is just pretty much stalled. So there are three main goals to building out the transmission grid to meet, future demand. First off, you need to build more regional transmission AC lines. Next, you need to build more high voltage direct current projects to enable long distance transmission between the interconnects. And third, you need to both upgrade and add new interties so you can enable the three interconnects to share more power. Storage and transmission are pretty important to solving seasonality and intermittency, but we're also going to need some other technologies. So building more solar and wind is going to be a really crucial one. It's not really a new technology per se, but it's really going to help with reducing both storage and transmission costs. Basically because you don't need to produce or you don't need to store as much, and you don't need to transmit as much when you just make more than you needed in the first place. That's going to be something that is considered region by region to reduce overall costs. Nuclear is going to be also really important to the grid moving forward, at least as far as keeping existing plants online is concerned. Extending the life cycles of existing plants is basically the cheapest option out there for clean zero carbon power. And nuclear also doesn't have any of the intermittency or seasonality issues to worry about. That being said, new nuclear plants aren't really cost effective. So that is really unlikely to happen unless you have a major policy or a major technological breakthrough. And then finally, carbon capture enables existing infrastructure to serve as a safety net to the grid. It's a really key technology that has major uses outside of just the power sector. And so pursuing that's going to be really, really important. Okay, so, taking a step back, technology is really important, right? It enables this transition to happen, but policy is what actually drives that change. And so next up, I want to take a look at 4 different policies that are, actually going to help drive this transition along. So the first one is called a renewable portfolio standard. Basically, it's a law that mandates a minimum level of renewable generation in a certain place by a certain time. And 30 states have already enacted it. Intuitively, their effectiveness basically depends on how you set it up. So if you set this optimistic but achievable target, then you can really drive decarbonization quite a bit. Next up is something called carbon pricing. It's pretty straightforward. It's just you pay a price to pollute, and it's been implemented globally, most notably in Europe and in China. But the most important thing with carbon pricing is, the pricing. How you price emissions matters a ton as far as how effective it is at reducing emissions. So this chart basically shows results for modeling different carbon pricing levels economy-wide. I really want to focus in on this $50 a ton scenario because about 80% of the additional emissions that are avoided over this current policy scenario on the left-hand side are expected to come from the power sector. Next up, I want to talk about transmission infrastructure. So a large component of how we improve transmission infrastructure comes from how we plan for it and how we pay for it. And right now, new generators have to pay the grid, have to basically pay to expand the grid capacity necessary for their to add their plant onto the grid, which seems pretty reasonable on at first glance, right? It doesn't really matter where you place a natural gas or a coal plant, but in an era of solar and wind, it makes a lot more sense to build out the transmission to enable optimal generation placement. This is exactly what happened with 2 enormously successful transmission infrastructure projects. In Texas, there's this thing called the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones, or CREZ, and there's another project called the MISO MVP. And in both cases, all it really is just transmission being planned regionally as opposed to this current, piecemeal method where both projects generate major economic benefits and reduce capital costs for transmission, and they also massively, boost renewable market penetration. But this model is also only enabled when end consumers share the transmission costs. So under the current system, many wind and solar projects are delayed while waiting for someone else to foot the bill for these new transmission lines. And then finally, I want to talk about supporting innovation. This is going to be really crucial for scaling up the technologies that can help in fully decarbonizing. So for example, carbon capture or improved hydrogen production. New technologies often face this chicken and egg problem where at small scales, they cost a lot of money, which in turn drives away potential consumers, which prevents them from scaling. But we can look to history to look at previous subsidies, such as the investment tax credit (ITC) and the production tax credit (PTC). These have been massively beneficial for assisting the wind and solar industries as they scaled. And so I think some reforms to these programs could really help improve the effectiveness. So I'm going to move on to some concrete proposals. So first off, I think a federal level RPS to decarbonize the entire US power grid by 2050 would give both a lot of guidance to firms, and B, it would also set a minimum speed to the transition. So, you'd probably want to have like interim 5-year targets. And, that would basically just help encourage both steady progress and improve enforceability. Second, for carbon pricing, a $50 a ton inflation adjusted economy-wide carbon price with a border adjustment tax would also be super helpful. Where the revenues go is kind of an open question right now, but I will merely note that the pandemic has really demonstrated the feasibility of the government just cutting every single person a check. And then third, in terms of boosting transmission infrastructure, there basically just needs to be a massive slashing of red tape, along with a adoption of a regional planning model to enable just vast amounts of solar and wind to be built. Basically, what I'm saying is that whatever happened in Texas needs to happen across the rest of the country. And then finally, supporting innovation can be done in a number of ways, though, I think really some key points would be extending the ITC and the PTC, changing to a direct payment method, or making the tax credits refundable, applying them to storage and other decarbonization projects. And I mentioned 4 things here. There's obviously more to it, but the real big takeaway is that you kind of want an all of the above thing to really drive decarbonization. Okay, so I know I've said a lot. With that, I'll open it up for Q&A.
Woohoo! So they are not able to unmute themselves. And so I wanted to give you Steph Cantu's question about what's the switching cost from fossil fuels like coal and maybe natural gas to solar and wind, maybe retraining some of those workers. So I know that coal is naturally declining and kind of on its own, but if you really have to force a switch from a popular fuel like natural gas, how difficult is it in real cost?
Okay, so the switching cost as far as like jobs are concerned is that on one hand, you're going to have a net like increase in the number of jobs available, right? The problem is though, is that whereas solar and wind jobs might be a little bit more diffuse in where they're created, coal and natural gas jobs are very concentrated. What is going to happen to these people? I don't know. I am a 23-year-old. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that one, right? I mean, that's going to be
extensively, guys, but this is not something he's had a chance to read up on. Hopefully will. Any other questions? I know I was asking, nuclear is so difficult to get through, so that in theory it might be 3 cents per kilowatt hour, but in practice it ends up being, I don't know, 10 cents per kilowatt hour, at least in the short term, because of the difficulty in getting the environmental permissions and the support of the public in the region. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's basically a very long history, unfortunately, of new projects, especially in Europe, because there aren't really that many new nuclear projects in the US. But a lot of new projects in Europe tend to be like pretty delayed. So I know there's a really infamous one called Hinkley Point C in the UK, where I don't even know how over budget that is. I don't even know how like over time that is. But there definitely is a poor track record of new nuclear plants actually being on time and under budget.
And are they making much smaller, safer plants now that, really couldn't have a big regional effect, even if they blew up or something, or had a, bad reaction effect? Are they making much smaller, safer ones that could be useful?
Yeah, I know there's a new technology called like small modular reactors, where it's basically the size of a truck, like an 18-wheeler, instead of, the massive behemoths that exist today. So I think there's a lot of work being done on that area, but I don't actually think there's a single actual example in the wild of an SMR plant that's actually built and operating today. I think it's coming soon, though. I think the test or I think demonstrations are supposed to be this decade.
Super, super. Thank you so much. I've put his email into that chat box for all of you who want to, follow up with more questions. And we will move to Megan McKenzie, who is not only in Plan II, but art and art history. She's going to be talking about History is Not a Building, a critical analysis of historic preservation. And her supervising professor is Karma Gorman.
Hi. Is that sharing okay? Everything good?
Great.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Megan, and my thesis title is History is Not a Building, a Critical Analysis of Historic Preservation. Through this thesis, I explore the foundations of the field of historic preservation, its current uses, and how the field could be improved to prevent the continued erasure of marginalized communities. So a very, very different direction than what we just heard. I chose to look specifically at Los Angeles County as a microcosm of the US due to its diverse population, rapidly changing demographics and neighborhoods, and its fraught history of racist urban planning. To give you a little bit of a historic background and a framework for historic preservation, while grassroots groups were organizing local preservation efforts much earlier, the field was first institutionalized on the national level in 1935 with the Historic Sites Act. The 1963 demolition of New York's Penn Station kind of marks the beginning of the modern field of historic preservation, with the model of essentially preventing the demolition of old buildings, if you will. And in 1965, the current criteria for preservation first appeared in writing, which are that buildings over 50 years of age are eligible for consideration for preservation if they meet at least one of the following criteria. One, associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of history. Two, associated with the lives of persons who are significant in the history. Three, embodying distinctive architectural characteristics of a type, a style, a period, a method of construction, or an architect or designer whose work is significant, or possessing artistic values of significance. Or four, a site that has yielded or may be likely to yield significant and important information regarding the prehistory or history of the region. And these criteria still stand pretty completely unchanged over the last 60 years. And there's a myriad of problems with them. First, the 50-year rule, as many buildings, especially in urban areas, and especially buildings that are not single-family residential, never turn 50 and never become old, to have that groundwork for preservation in place. Secondly, the fixation on associations with famous architects serves to reinforce the canon of architectural history, which focuses on celebrating the geniuses of individual white men. Third, appeals to external authorities such as history and literature are often used to make seemingly more objective arguments for preservation in ways which often do not engage local communities. And fourth, all of these criteria make historic preservation off limits to people of color. For generations, people of color in the US could not work as licensed architects to produce works that would be preserved one day, could not build generational wealth in the same ways that white people could to enable the commissioning of architecture, and other more specific into the urban context, movements like slum clearance, quote, urban renewal movements, and modern gentrification have erased the built history of people of color in the United States. I have two main case studies to look at, which demonstrate the breadth of history that is demonstrated by the built environment in the US, and which is preserved through historic preservation, or attempted to be preserved through historic preservation. First is the Blacker House, built in 1907 by Green & Green in Pasadena. Here you can see a view of the interior and a detail image of the building. The house was designed as a Gesamtkunstwerk, or a total work of art. Every element from the grounds, the exterior, the interior, the fixtures, the finishes, the furnishings were all designed by the architects Green & Green as a total work of art that would all encompass the entire built environment in an immersive architectural experience. The house was bought in May 1985 by Barton English, who promptly began stripping the house of its Green & Green designed furniture and finishes to sell on the art market. What he removed was worth an estimated $1 million at the time. To give you a little bit of context, here are some items from the Green & Green Blacker House that have sold recently. This lamp sold in 2015 for $502,000. In 2000, this little settee sold for $292,000. Really trouncing the estimate of auction that was $50,000 to $70,000. And in 2007, this chair sold for just under $1 million. And to give you some context for the spread, the diffusion of these objects out from the Blacker House. Here are the front doors of the Blacker House in the collection of the Dallas Museum of Art. This side chair, 3 of them, one at the Met, one at the Yale University Art Gallery, and one in the collection of the Fine Arts Museums in San Francisco. Lanterns at the Met and the St. Louis Art Museum, and this mirror at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. English's actions sparked an incredible amount of community activation and backlash. At the time, this was national news, referred to as the, quote, rape of the Blacker House. People were writing op-eds, letters to the editor of local papers. People were incredibly upset that he would do such a thing, even though, as this house was private property, he was completely within his rights to do so. By June, 1 month after his purchase of the Blacker House, the Pasadena Board of City Directors had passed an emergency ordinance to prohibit the removal of further interior fixtures from buildings over 50 years of age, which would encompass the Blacker House, but also over half of the homes in Pasadena. By 1987, the city passed the Blacker Ordinance, which required city permission to remove more fixtures. And after removing a truly vast number of fixtures and finishes from the home, English sold the house. In 1994, it was purchased by the Nells, who you see here in the front stairway of the home, who embarked on an incredibly expensive restoration project under the guidance of Randall Mackinson, a professor at USC and an expert on green and green architecture. And the house has been pretty fully restored at this point, with a very intentional eye to what Green and Green would have wanted and how to keep the house as true as possible to their original vision. And in this situation, historic preservation worked as the field is designed to work. A property was endangered, a public outcry followed, and owners with money were found to undertake a lengthy restoration and to ensure the care and keeping of the property going forward. At no point in the process was there any question of the value of the house because of its attachment to the Green and Green name and because of the cultural cachet that name carries for them as canonized architectural geniuses. However, it's incredibly important, to me at least, to note that no real history in any formal sense is being transmitted through the site. The value, no one really knows who the Blackers are. The value is entirely in the building for architectural study and for its own sake, rather than as any mean for memorializing or retelling histories in any real sense. At the far end of the spectrum of historic preservation, we have the Circus Disco in Hollywood. It opened in 1974 in a 20,000 square foot warehouse by Eugene LaPietra and his late partner, Eddie Lemos. Here, here you can see some more views of the exterior of the building, just for a sense of its averageness, and the clown entrance. And here you can see a few images of the interior. As you can tell, it was a disco. They opened the place to serve as a disco, specifically serving a queer Latinx clientele who were excluded from predominantly white gay clubs in West Hollywood. It served both as a queer space and a community space at night, and as a community space that hosted political events and fundraisers for LGBT rights and labor organizing. The club closed at the end of 2015 as the owners sold the property to developers after 40 years in business. Hollywood Heritage, a community nonprofit volunteer preservation organization, advocated for the building to be classified as a historic cultural monument by Los Angeles' Cultural Heritage Commission, which would have created barriers for demolition, but they settled privately for certain elements of the club to be preserved in the interiors of the new development. This move, they said, was focused not on preserving the architecture, but their goal was ensuring that the Circus Disco's place in local LGBT history was not paved over. 40 years worth of dancers and clubgoers and community activists developed a sense of communal ownership of the space because of their role in defining its history. The history that would be preserved, that would have been preserved through the preservation of the disco, is what happened there and the communities it hosted and the communities it built, rather than the building itself. Here's what stands on the site of the Circus Disco now. New build gentrification, wherein pre-existing architecture is demolished to make way for new developments that are home to new communities, not only displaces people, but inherently destroys the sense of place and of existing within a shared history. History is often an early casualty of gentrification. The erasure of a community's place-based history and community spaces effectively erases those communities, contributing to their displacement. I'm sure many of us who have driven through East Austin anytime recently kind of recognize this building. It's quintessential of new build gentrification nationwide in the US, and how that forces, how that erases the site specificity of a neighborhood. This could be anywhere when you look at this photo. Okay. Contrasting these two sites shows us the breadth of sites that are currently preserved under the umbrella of historic preservation. Although both the Blacker House and the Circus Disco hold unique cultural value, they're incredibly different and can't be effectively preserved using the same methods or the same limited criteria or the same limited legislative structure. The Blacker House is aligned with fine art conservation. The building embodies no history other than the architectural. The restoration demonstrates a clear interest in focusing on material authenticity and old age. The value of the site is in the building, its materials, its age, its aesthetic merit, and its alignment with the canonized genius of Green and Green. The disco, on the other hand, demonstrates a new interest in architecturally unremarkable sites of great cultural importance. The second model of historic preservation foregrounds sites that are of importance to individuals and communities, using historic preservation as a tool for community building and community preservation, rather than focusing on preservation of buildings for their interest to architectural historians and specialists outside of the local community. Due to biased preservation practices and broader biases in what histories have been deemed worth retelling, irreplaceable elements of the histories of marginalized communities in the US have already been lost. In order to prevent further losses, historic preservationists must reconsider what the field has accomplished in the past 90 years and how outdated frameworks can be recalibrated to allow for a more equitable future of historic preservation. Splitting the field that is currently historic preservation into two branches, historic preservation, as seen in the circus disco, where the end goal is to preserve a community history, and architectural conservation, as seen in the Blacker House, where the end goal is to conserve a building as a work of art, with their own distinct operational goals and independent frameworks for evaluation and execution of preservation efforts, would allow both branches to function more effectively separately. Yeah. That's my presentation. If anyone has any questions, I don't know if I can see the chat or anything like that. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, so Logan Larson asks, what do you think about the difference between public versus private spaces in terms of how the government can interact?
Yeah, I think that is the question. I think that was a huge question in the preservation battle around the Blacker House of what crosses the boundaries of private property ownership. I think there's also a lot of big ethical questions about when preservation, which they often are, to clarify, in this country, preservation dollars are often prioritized towards private homes. They get, places like the Blacker House in California, the Mills Act provides very significant property tax cuts for the owners of historic homes. So there is like a huge financial incentive, and what am I trying to say? The preservation dollars, which are already very limited in a country that does not prioritize this in the budgets, are going towards private homes. It is inherently much harder to preserve public spaces and commercial spaces in particular, because changing needs in those spaces kind of prohibit it inherently. So yeah, that's the big question, I think, is how to navigate that. Yeah.
It's interesting to me because, commercial property developers will spend a lot more for the land and the location, and so they can really outbid residential. But then residential homes tend to last like 100 years on average in this country, versus commercial properties have about half that as their average lifespan.
Yeah, exactly. And places like the Circus Disco, there were efforts, not necessarily efforts, but there was a sentiment that it would have been amazing to keep this property in the queer community. If there was, a nonprofit that could have used it, maybe it could have been a shelter for queer youth or something like that. But they sold the property for $75 million. There's nobody in Los Angeles's LGBT community who had a $75 million check on hand to keep it in the community. So yeah, these market interests and real estate interests in these cities that are really rapidly changing and gentrifying often, and rising in real estate values. Yeah, it's such a complicated issue.
Well, something that I personally would like to see is moving the key features of a large property elsewhere, and moving the entire small. So recently in San Francisco downtown, I think on Market Street, they moved a small corner building. It was an amazing engineering feat to get it out of there, and just barely cleared some of the street signs. And you can see that online if you look for it. But I think that's really smart, is get it out of these very expensive, the land is incredibly valuable, and that's probably not the highest and best use of that location, and move it to a place where they can really enjoy it, maybe a park. I mean, look at that Circus Disco entrance. That's just a really fun thing. Were they able to preserve that somewhere?
I'm actually not sure, because this building is there now, and there was this agreement, but they have, stock photos of the shared spaces of the apartment complex and stuff like that, and I was not able to find any evidence of that having actually come to fruition on the building's website. And again, like you said, with real estate values, a studio apartment in this building starts at $2,300 a month. It's just a complete erasure of this community that kind of can no longer afford to be there. And yeah, it's really interesting to me. Yeah. Sorry.
Can I ask you one more question?
Yes.
My parents grew up in Chicago, and I know, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mies van der Rohe and
Yeah.
these kinds of people. So is Chicago kind of the best example we have of historic preservation in this country, or are there other cities that do it better?
That's a good question. Most of my reading was specific about Los Angeles because that's kind of where I decided to pull all my case studies from. From my understanding, New York is the best because they were kind of, with the loss of Penn Station, after that, New York was the first city to pass a specific historic preservation act within the city context that would prevent demolition and create barriers to demolition in, our modern sense of preservation. So New York kind of paved the way in that way.
Great, great. And yeah, there is a lot of money in New York, and of course, much higher densities. So hopefully they started with higher densities and were able to reuse those buildings on site.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Megan. We are going to turn now to somebody who I think is a 5th year and actually getting an MBA at the same time. Sort of, he's been doing his Plan II work, and this is Billy Lee, of course. And he's going to be talking about climate change's impact on the U.S. whiskey industry. So I don't even think you're 21 yet. Oh, wait, yes, you are, Billy. You better be 21 so that you can properly research this topic for us.
Of course, yeah. Whenever I went onto the websites, they always made me make sure I was 21. So if I wasn't, it would have been very difficult to do this thesis.
Yeah, what a topic.
All right, great. Let me try to get my screen sharing very quickly.
And I should mention that Professor Joshua Rock is the supervisor on this one.
Can y'all see this?
Yes, looks appetizing.
Awesome. Great. Well, here, let's go ahead and get started then. Hey everyone, my name is Billy Lee, and my supervisor is Joshua Rock, and my second reader is Sarah Toynbee. And today I'm going to be investigating climate change's impact on the United States whiskey industry. So I have a quick question for all of us. I know I can't really see the participants tab, so someone's probably going to have to tell me, but who here is over the age of 21? I think I'll need help here. Let me see if I can pull it up as well.
So feel free to raise your hands in the reaction area, folks.
Yeah, out of concern for time, I'm going to hope most of y'all are. So if you are 21, then you can continue to listen in. If you're under 21, unfortunately, I'm going to have you replace every whiskey that I say with juice. But I'm going to go ahead and just give y'all an introduction of why I got interested in this topic, because I think a question that I've gotten a lot is how did you kind of intersect climate change and whiskey together? And I think this was actually because during junior year, I actually took a class, I believe was Saagar, and it was about the law and ethics of climate change and sustainabilities. And it kind of broke up the monotony of my accounting courses, where I saw that climate change actually has a lot of reaches in areas of my life that I kind of take for granted. And then also during the beginning of the pandemic, one way I connected with my roommate was actually through whiskey. And so that was right about when I was choosing a topic. And so I thought it would be kind of interesting to be able to explore the relationship between climate change and whiskey together. So the question that I'm going to be trying to answering today is, in what ways will climate change impact the United States whiskey industry? Sorry, let me click this real quick. So to understand this topic, I think it would be important to give a quick background on climate change. So to define climate, it is the prevailing weather conditions in an area in general over a long period of time. So you've probably heard about how climate is changing, and one of the most common phrases with climate change is global warming. We have observed temperature rises of about 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.85 degrees Celsius from 1860 to now. And people often wonder, whenever we talk about climate change, of how much of global warming and climate change is natural, which would occurred without humans, or versus caused by humans. An IPCC study, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change study, showed that there's actually a 90% chance that humans are responsible for at least some part of the observed global warming in the last 50 years. And this is because a big reason is because of carbon dioxide. And so to explain this, greenhouse gas is actually something that what carbon dioxide is classified as. And so because of human involvement and human actions, we produce a lot of carbon dioxide through burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and et cetera. And if we can take a look at this graph on screen, we see that for a millennia, the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has not risen above the 300 parts per million level until in the last century, where we can see from 1950 until now, we've had a steep jump from 280 parts per million to 380 parts per million. So the thing about greenhouse gases is whenever we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it actually creates more of a warming environment and traps more heat. Because when the sun actually radiates heat onto the earth absorbs some of it and reflects some of it back into space. And the atmosphere actually traps a lot of this heat, which is a good thing for us, because if we didn't have an atmosphere, then Earth wouldn't be sustainable for life. However, as we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then it's going to trap more heat, which is what ultimately we're seeing in terms of the warming and that relationship there. To move on, I think also it's probably important to understand the whiskey and how it's made, because a big impact of climate change is the process. And so here's a cool little graphic that outlines the 6 steps and summarizes it very quickly. But to talk it through, the first step is the preparation process, where you get the grains that are going to go into the whiskey and you dry it out and you heat it up. And then the second process is combining these grains with water, and then you mash it up together to create something called the mash bill. Then afterwards, you bring it into a fermentation tank. And so for all alcohol, you add yeast, and yeast actually consumes the sugars in these grains and whatever else you put in there and excretes alcohol as their waste. And so that's a fun little fact for all the alcohol that we consume. And then afterwards, we take this alcoholic grain mixture and we put it into a distilling pot, which is usually like a pot still or something else. And we actually heat up this mixture. And so alcohol will evaporate first and then eventually condensate and be collected. And this collected alcohol is usually called white dog or white lightning in the whiskey industry. And this will be very clear and very strong and is put into barrels for aging. And so usually the barrels are made out of American white oak. And this will impart a lot of the flavors and characteristics of the whiskey that you usually taste whenever you're drinking the whiskey. And finally, after 20 to 30 years or however long the distillery wants to age the actual whiskey, then they put it into the bottles for all of us to enjoy. And so now we can go ahead and talk about how I answered the question of climate change and how it impacts the United States whiskey industry in general. So my methodology for going about answering this question is I conducted interviews with distilleries to get their perspective, and also I conducted primary research as well as follow-up research that informed the interviews, and also I was able to follow up on points that they brought up. I had 5 distilleries respond for an interview, which each of the interviewees having intimate knowledge of the whiskey making process. The distilleries were 4 Roses, Wilderness Trail, Balcones, TX Whiskey, and Still Austin. And 3 of these were in Texas and 2 of these were in Kentucky. These interviews were semi-structured with a set list of questions to ask each distillery for consistency's sake, and then also allowing for follow-up questions on topics that they brought up that I thought were interesting that would also help further answer the question. After all the interviews were conducted, I conducted thematic analysis to analyze this qualitative data that I got from them, which basically means I went through the data and I coded for keywords and themes that I thought were prevalent and important. And then I reviewed and revised them and came up with 5 main themes that I was able to investigate further. So as a result, these are the 5 main themes that I got from the interviews that I had. The 5 results or the 5 themes are grain variety, barrel aging, wood, water, and adaptation. So for grain variety, like I talked in the beginning, the first step of the process is actually, the grains, preparing them for making it into the mash bill. And so weather events could actually result in a negative impact on grain quality and yield. So for example, corn is the main ingredient in a lot of United States whiskey. Because bourbon has to be produced in America, and bourbon also is required to be more than 50% corn. So corn is one of the biggest ingredients for whiskey. Some of the studies that I've conducted have shown that they're projecting an increase in global mean temperatures and crop yields will decline, while it'll also increase the variability in yields from year to year. This could impact the whiskey process because it could drive up prices for these distilleries and also change the quality of the corn that is going to them for whiskey, which could impact the quality of their final product overall. The next theme is barrel aging, and barrel aging is crucial to developing the flavors in whiskey. So climate is extremely influential on aging because it changes the amount of evaporation, the expansion and contraction of the wood, and what wood molecules are kind of pulled into the whiskey. So Balcones, which is a distillery in Waco that I talked about, they said that an increase in future temperature could actually impact barrel aging a lot. Because if winters are warmer in general, there will be less contraction because whenever it's hot outside, the barrels will expand and whiskey can seep into the pores. And then whenever it's cold, then it contracts. And so all the whiskey that were in the pores pulls out a lot of the molecules that were in while they were inside of the pores of the oak barrel. And so it means that if winters are warmer in general, there will be less contraction in the barrels, which means that there's going to be less tannins that are pulled from the barrels into the whiskey. And so tannins are naturally occurring chemicals that contribute to the taste, mouthfeel, appearance, and flavor profile of the whiskey overall. And if you drink wine ever at all, grapes also have tannins, and that's generally what leaves that mouthfeel of dryness in your mouth. Then the next theme is wood, which refers to the wood that is used to make barrels for whiskey aging. So like I talked about it before, the primary wood used in the United States is American white oak because bourbon by law is required to use new American charred white oak barrels, which is kind of very specific, but it's something that allows something to be classified as bourbon. And so climate increases disease pressures as well as influences the drying out process of the wood being used for these barrels. So if temperatures are hotter, it actually could provide a better environment for diseases to thrive. An example of this actually is a plant pathogen that caused this thing called the sudden oak death in the 1990s to now. And it's killed off millions of tan oak trees and other species of oaks. And so rising temperatures might provide a better environment for diseases to thrive. And if something were to happen in the future, then it could put the supply of oak in, threaten the supply of oak for the barrels in the future. Finally, one of the themes before we go on to adaptation is water. And so water is extremely crucial in the whiskey making process from grain to glass. Water affects almost every single part of the process, and climate affects the availability of water for the distilleries making the whiskey. Water is used to water the grains, obviously to help it grow, and then it's also used to generate steam to heat up the products during the distillation, the fermentation process, also during the distillation process. It's also used to help cool down the products, and it's used in the product. So it's through every single step of the process, you're going to have water involved there. Four Roses was a distillery I also talked to, and they said that they originally sourced their water from the Salt River, which is not salty, but it's called the Salt River. And it would dry up in the summers as in the recent years. And so they were completely at the mercy of the flow rate. And they were using this water to help cool down the distillation or the mash whenever they heated it up so it can go into the next step of the process. So furthermore, Still Austin, which is a distillery in Austin, noted that the Ogallala Aquifer, which actually supports 1/6 of the world's grain produce, is depleting faster than it restores, which would also threaten the availability of water in the future. And finally, I'll talk about adaptation, which was actually a big theme that I gathered from the interviews. These distilleries may actually face pressure from the government to reduce their carbon footprint, while also they might see consumer preferences shift towards more eco-friendly distilleries overall, all while having to deal with how climate change affects the process like I just talked about beforehand. So therefore, one of the big effects of the whiskey industry is that they might have to adapt going forward in order to balance all of these factors that are influencing them. And so finally, we'll talk about the adaptation methods that will help these whiskey distilleries adapt to climate change and the impacts of it. So for grains, like I talked about before, one way that they can actually adapt is by starting to cultivate new climate-resistant grain varieties. And this is actually seen in the cognac industry, where cognac in a little region of France called Cognac, it's a specific type of brandy that you have to have certain regulations to be able to be labeled as that. And 98% of the cognac is actually produced by one specific form of grape. However, in the recent 5 years, they found that because of rising temperatures, they were unable to actually, like the grapes that they were using would actually ripe too quickly and have too much sweetness versus the acidity that they need for cognac. And so they've been looking into actually creating new climate-resistant grain varieties overall to resist any overheating or climate change or temperature variations or precipitation level fluctuations. And that is something that could be applied as well here for the corn, wheat, barley, or rye that is put into the whiskey as well. The next is barrel aging. If we're talking about the temperature impacting the contraction and the expansion in the barrels, then one way that they could actually adapt to this and create a more consistent product is through climate controlling their warehouses, or basically being able to install maybe AC units or actually put their warehouses underground. And this is something that actually is already done in Scotland, where they have a pseudo method of climate controlling by putting their warehouses underground so they can see less fluctuations in the temperatures that their whiskey is actually experiencing. Another one is wood. And so one thing that could be done is actually using more varieties of oak and different types of wood than just American white oak. And this actually might influence the legislation that is, influences what would be able to be called bourbon. One distillery that I talked to, again, called TX Whiskey, they were talking about how in the future, if the temperatures were rising, then they might use Hungarian oak or French oak because it has more tannins in the oak. So then if there was a lack of tannins because of increased global temperatures, then they could counteract that by using a wood that might have more tannins overall. And then also water is important. One thing that Four Roses talked about is using a closed water loop system. And instead of using water from an outside source, bringing it in and to use it to cool down the process, they have a closed water loop system where they cycle the same water throughout the entire system. So it's cold and it can cool down the product, but then it's also brought up to a different part of the process and then heated up as well. And it cycles the heat around while also being very efficient with the water, because you're using the same water and you're losing very little. And so this is one way to counteract and help prevent the expenditure of a lot of water and help mitigate the availability of water and that being a problem in the future. Another way is to reduce their transportation footprint. And now we're getting into ways that they might need to adapt in order to fit the consumer preferences or the governmental regulations that are being put in place. And one thing that these distilleries could do is actually work with local farmers in order to reduce their transportation footprint. So instead of shipping their grains from the other side of the world or trying to have a bunch of different trucks bring it here and there, they can work with local farmers. That also has the benefit of increasing the biodiversity in the region and also reduces the overall transportation footprint, because then instead of shipping the grains very far, now they're only just shipping their final product. We're getting towards the end of the adaptation methods, and then renewable energy sources is one thing that they can look into as well. And right now they're actually using gas-powered boilers, which is very efficient compared to the amount of energy that they need. But in the future, as technology improves and maybe there's more nuclear options or solar and wind, then they could eventually transfer all of their energy usage to renewable, which would be a good way to reduce their carbon footprint as well. Then conservation is actually the easiest way while also being the least expensive way to reduce their carbon footprint. And one thing that they can do is called the infusion mashing process. And this is something that Wilderness Trail brought up. So during the process of bringing the entire mash bill to a boil, usually a lot of distilleries bring it up to 212 degrees or boiling, so they could gelatinize the starches and then eventually allow the yeast to be able to convert these sugars into alcohol. But Wilderness Trail found out that corn, rye, barley, they don't actually require 212 degrees to be able to gelatinize these starches. Corn only requires 185 degrees to be able to gelatinize the starches, rye even lower, and barley even lower than that. And so one way that you can conserve the energy is, instead of heating the entire mix up to 212, you can first put in the corn, heat it up to 185, and then step down the process as it cools down, and then you can add your barley and then you can add your rye. This way you save the amount of thousands and thousands of gallons that you have to heat up first and foremost. And then also you don't have to heat it up as much, which allows us to save overall a lot of energy and is more efficient. And finally, one thing that still Austin brought up that we could look into is reusing glass bottles. And this one might be a little bit difficult because of the legislation, but they actually mentioned that for them, this is their biggest area of their carbon footprint, because glass bottles, the amount of energy and the carbon footprint it requires to create these bottles, these glass bottles could actually be used over 50 times before they need to be thrown away. And so this is something that is being piloted in the beer industry and something that is interesting to look into. So overall, I've discussed the ways that climate change will impact the United States whiskey industry, and I've discussed how an introduction to climate change and also just a general whiskey introduction as well. So I hope this was informative, and I definitely am open to questions, and I had a great time enjoying researching this. So thank you all for your time and sitting through this.
Thank you, Billy. So is it true you already have your undergraduate degree and now you're going for your MBA? Is that how it's working?
Yeah, so I have my undergraduate degree in accounting, and then there is this MPA program called Master in Professional Accounting program, where I get an integrated master's program through 5 years here at UT. So it's a pretty cool deal.
And did you have to apply for that after 2 years here so they could see how well you were doing? Yeah, my husband was recently looking at that. I have twin 17-year-olds, so.
Yes, exactly.
And your friend Saagar asked if there are some regions of the world that will be more or less affected by climate change in terms of their alcohol production, whether it's Scotch, bourbon, or Japanese whiskey.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think that the thing is, it seems like because of how globalized, I guess, whiskey is in general, there's going to be a lot of adaptation methods that bourbon and whiskey in general can see compared to something like cognac, because cognac is geographically limited into a specific area. And so if anything happens to the grapes in that region, then they're completely out of luck. And so I think that in terms of whiskey from different areas, like I've talked about, Scotch, they already see, different climate controlling warehouses. And then a bourbon is something that is also kind of adapting as time goes on. But I think in general, it seems like unless the prices of something is going to be going up very quickly, I think that like for the most part, they will be able to adapt. And one of the sentiments that a few of the whiskey distilleries kind of talked about was that they felt like climate change was such a slow process that they didn't feel like there was a huge need to adapt right now. So I think that's something that is interesting to kind of think about, because for them, they're kind of on the front lines and they see how it's affecting them, but they're kind of adapting as time goes on. So if you're wanting to invest, I think not because of climate change, I think bourbon is a great place to invest because the secondary market is something that has been exploding, especially since the pandemic. The demand has been incredible compared to the supply. And if you think about bourbon, the supply is constricted to over, however long they're aging it. So stuff that you're drinking right now and buying in the store right now might have been put into the barrel 6 years ago. So right now, you think about the stuff they're putting in, they're projecting for 12, 20 years, 30 years out for the demand then. And so a lot of places have been doubling their production and just trying to figure out how they can meet up with production and stuff like that.
Well, I know as a California native, I moved here 23 years ago, but the wildfires were devastating for them. And of course, that was preceded by long drought. And we had, of course, a snowpocalypse here. And so a lot of the agricultural industry and the wine industry being heavily impacted. Do you think California winemakers have a lot to worry about going forward?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing too, because wine is somewhat similar to brandy, because wine is one of the inputs for brandy, which is, also cognac is a specific version. I think the thing about grapes are that it requires like a very specific environment in terms of the climate to be able to grow it, which is why California and Argentina, France, these specific areas are more, prone to being able to grow good grapes. And so I think that with climate change, the wine industry is something that is definitely going to be affected a lot. Like I said, the grapes, especially if you're talking about, like their specific categorizations, wine also loves to talk a lot about where it's from, the geographic regions in which it's constricted from. In California, it's written on all the bottles. And so I think that as time goes on, it'll be something that they'll also need to figure out how to adapt, which is why talking about the grapes in cognac, they're actually going to be continuing to research and try to figure out new climate resistant varieties of grapes to be able to adapt to anything that happens there. But in cognac also, they experienced a lot of climate related disasters in the past 5 years. So actually in 2016, I think there was a permafrost that actually, or not a permafrost, but a frost that affected 25% of all the crops. In 2017, they had a huge hailstorm that also reduced some of the vineyards lost 98% of their actual production. And then I think in 2018, they had just huge storms as well. And so if this were to happen, it would really suck. And so I think grapes are also a lot more dainty than probably corn crops. And so that'll be something that is going to be affected as well.
And I don't know if you noticed, Megan posted a question about the efforts that you suggested they might take. You did mention that they're not reacting as fast as one might think. And so is there an emerging sustainable liquor market? Anything special, anybody special tagging, maybe that also just offsetting their carbon footprints, things like this, anything you're seeing like that in the market?
Yeah, no, of course. And so I think there's some places that are a little bit more old school and they're doing it the way they've been doing. But through my research, it was actually really encouraging to see what some distilleries are doing. So I have two examples off of the top of my head from my interviews. Four Roses was the one I was talking about with their water, their closed loop water system. They just, had a huge expansion of their production process and they created a whole new building. And so that was one of the innovations that they created to try to, I think environmental stewardship is one thing that they're really, trying to focus on as well overall. And then still Austin is actually pretty inspiring too. So if you're an Austinite or someone in the area, I will plug it obviously because I'm an Austinite as well. But still Austin actually is a pretty recent distillery that occurred and came up in the last 10 years. And the CEO is someone that I got to speak to, and he is actually like an environmentalist for Eco Canada before he worked as a distillery head. And so he was extremely conscious in the ways that he was going about creating his whiskey. And so he was the one that was talking a lot about how he was working with local grain producers and varieties, using different varieties of crops, also being careful about water availability and just overall trying to reduce their overall footprint. And I think in different industries, they might be moving a little bit quickly. Like one company called Sierra Nevada, which is a beer company, a craft brewery, they're, I think, taking the lead in pioneering, just becoming almost, just trying to recycle their own glass and doing different things to be carbon neutral. And there actually is one of these really, really big distilleries that's escaping my mind, but they've actually committed to being completely carbon neutral. So I think this is something that even the whiskey industry is catching on to. I don't think it's as quick as cognac or maybe even beer because some of their inputs are not being affected as much, but it's cool to see that there are some distilleries that are already thinking about that.
Yeah, I was touring the Boulder area not too long ago, or Colorado, and we stopped by the Coors plant, and water is incredibly important to that production, but they're very careful with how they reuse things because it's expensive to generate a bunch of waste, and so hopefully we'll see more of that in all industries. I think plastics is something we should be paying for the recycling when we buy the item, and of course Europe is way ahead of us on all of this. We really should be paying for the life cycle of the product that we purchase so that it is properly disposed of, even if we're sloppy in how we separate our trash and this kind of thing. Any questions? If anybody wants to raise their hands, we can always unmute you, I think, directly to allow you to speak. But I think we're all very proud of these students working so hard. Plan II is, of course, for honor students only. And these students all had other degrees going on at the same time. So just really impressive and so nice to meet you all today. We appreciate everybody who's been on and those who've stayed on the entire session. These are very distinct, papers and products, but I think we learned a lot tonight. So with that, I think we'll let you go celebrate, and I understand that your advisor is over 21. So yeah, we really appreciate this. We wish you the best of luck. Are you going to be graduating, I guess, in May then, in just next month? Okay, and Megan and Saagar, you're graduating right now too. So yeah, I'm on campus every day. Feel free to come by and good luck with the new plans that you have for the summer and beyond.